So as Valentina was saying, the presentation is about the intersection between the Laban Bartenieff Movement System, which I will talk about, and concepts that come from neuroscience, which is also my academic background as a biologist. I teach for the dance department at Barnard College, at Hunter College. I also teach for the Laban Bartenieff Institute. And as Valentina was saying, I work as a dance therapist, and I'm the chair of the Research and Practice Committee of the American Dance Therapy Association. The Laban Bartenieff Movement System draws its own name from Laban and Bartenieff, who are the two figures you see on the left side. And other collaborators that developed this system with them are Judith Kestenberg, that you might have heard of, and Warren Lamb. So this is really collective collection of knowledge, which forms eventually from these figures and the lineage that descends from them, a conceptual framework that is utilized for the embodiment of movement, the observation of movement, and the writing of movement. So if I can show you this short clip for a moment. I wanted to give you a sense of when we say embodiment of movement. This is early exploration in the 20th century of a group that is self-coordinating. They are making choices without speaking, just sensing each other. And I want to pause for a moment because the idea here is collective choice, which was pretty radical at the beginning of the 20th century. It's also the idea of rhythm as coming from the body and not coming from music. Other radical ideas that were explored back at the time in the early 1900s, ideas related to weight and gravity, its opposite, which is levity. As you see, this idea of flying, the rising up and the falling of the dancers to the floor. This kind of aesthetics, which may seem very familiar to you, was not very common at the time in European modern dance, as well as the idea or the concept of the movement having a clear geometry, which also to us 100 years later may seem trivial. But as you can see, it's like movement as visual art, a dynamic visual art. And on the right side of the slide, you see an example of notation, which is also something that the system produced to elevate the status of dance to the status of other art forms that have a system of notation, for example, music. So through this conceptual framework, you can embody movement, observe it, and write it. The framework is also referred to as body, effort, space, and shape, because these are four categories that the system contemplates. And I like to call them categories of inquiry. So places where we can pose questions when we observe movement, when we perform a movement, when we want to describe it. And I want to give you, for this presentation, a touch of what these categories contains, which questions they contain, and what may be the relationship to concepts that come from the neuroscience field or reflections that are brought up currently in neuroscience. So beginning with the body, and questions that pertain to the body have to do with what part of the body is moving. So this is, you may ask this question in many different fields, including biomechanics, where you can say, oh, well, I see the head moving, I see a hand moving. So, and the body part is really the subject here, okay? And then there's the action that this body part or the entire body is performing, which is kind of the what, the verb. So the hand is closing or the head is turning. So who is doing what? And more profoundly, then there's a reflection around patterns that are observed between body parts. As for example, the relationship between the core and the distals, sometimes referred to as central peripheral or proximal distal. the relationship between the head and the tail, the upper part of the body above the waist, below the waist, to the right, to the left, what's called body half, cross-lateral, across the body through diagonals that brings you into spirals. So these are patterns, relationships between features, parts of the body. So currently, like in the neuroscience field, like it's very known, like this is early knowledge, but I want to bring this up because of a reflection around it. So this is just a picture of the famous homunculus that represent the representation in somatosensory cortex and in motor cortex of different body parts. So you see that there are different body parts with different representations. I like this picture just because it gives us a sense that when we describe what the body's doing, there are always two ways to look at it. One is the action. So we move because we act. In fact, the question typically asked is, what is the body doing? As if movement is doing something. On the other hand, because this is a somatic practice, movement is about sensing. So movement is a system of collection of sensation and which is the input for knowledge, for knowing many different things, knowing where the body is in space, knowing what's moving, knowing what's engaged. And you may know how important that may be at a cognitive level, at an emotional level, and which has been popularized by books such as The Body Keeps the Score. This is just an example of an extremely famous book that talks about somatic practice and trauma, and what does movement do in terms of evoking sensation that then triggers a system of association specific to the individual related to their history, perhaps sometimes traumatic. So how movement can be the door to reshaping or reframing certain bodily experiences in function of healing for if the person has trauma. So this is just an example of the centrality of the body when we look at movement. And this is stating the obvious because this is where we begin with when we look at movement. Another very obvious feature of movement is that the next thing typically asked when we look at movement, we see who is doing what. So the head is turning. The next thing that you will ask me, perhaps if I show you this movement, you'll ask me, is it turning to the left? Is it turning to the right? So at that point, your language is shifting from the subject, which is a body part, the action, which is a body action, to another concept of movement, which is space. Space is concerned with, if you look at this second question, where is the movement from or to? For example, the head is facing forward, turning to, in this case, the right. So questions that concern movement have to do with where is the movement going, from where to where, which kind of pathway is it tracing? Because if my hand moves from the left side to the front, I could pass through my center to go there. I could also stay peripheral. So when I start to use these words, central and peripheral, I'm assuming a certain understanding of the organization, the structure of the space surrounding the body. So this was one important reflection Laban brought up. And he described this concept called kinesphere. I'll read it for you. It's the sphere around the body whose periphery can be reached by easily extended limbs without stepping away from that place, which is the point of support when standing on one foot. What does this mean? This means that if you are standing and not moving around, so you're not locomoting anywhere, and you explore the space within your reach, which is different from the space beyond your reach at many levels, at a level of interaction, at a level of neural mapping, but the space within your reach holds specific significance. So that space is not spherical, technically, but it is called the kinesphere because ideally we want to ask a mover to think of the space as equally valuable, because pretty much everybody has a dominant side, right or left. So we want to encourage a mover to say, reach to the right as much as to the left in terms of dominant or non-dominant. And similarly, attend to the space in front of you as much as to the space behind you, as an ideal tension that opens up spatial awareness three-dimensionally. So in terms of connection to the neuroscience field, in this case, I want to bring up the work of the psychologist Barbara Tversky, who wrote this beautiful book, Mind in Motion, because in this book, she really writes about how our very capacity to navigate and organize space is related to our capacity to organize and create connections between abstract thoughts and abstract thinking. So movement is one of the foundations of cognition, spatially so. And the interesting description that Laban offered beyond the kinesphere has to do with the use of platonic solids that you see here. It's a series of three-dimensional objects that have that progress from what you see at the top left, which is called the tetrahedron, to the octahedron, the cube, the icosahedron, the dodecahedron. So if you think about where you are right now, and I'm not seeing the room in which you are, but I can roughly tell you that the room in which I am pretty much has 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. So that architecture is exemplified by this shape here, the cube. In fact, many workspaces are designed as cubes, also called cubicles. So think about it, because this is what actually Laban is trying to describe. And he's describing, when he talks about space, the fact that a human being sitting down may be in a tetrahedral form. As we stand up, there is a direction upward, downward, right, left, front, back, which is an octahedron. And then the space around us could be a cube. There are planes that form the icosahedron. So this is a complex theory, but it just tells us that whether we are aware of it or not, we hold structures of organization of the space around us. That's how we navigate environment. That's how we make sense of where we are. Now, as in Mind in Motion, what is particularly important to know, and it takes us to the next concept, which is effort, is that space is not just space. Mind in Motion talks about spatial organization as systems of relationships that organize abstract ideas. So in Laban's theory, he mapped into this spatial three-dimensional solids, he mapped meaning. So for pretty much all of us, there's different meanings or systems of associations to space. Whatever abstract concept we are willing to map, quote unquote, upward, is different from what we map downward. It's different from what we map in front of us or behind us. For example, for many of us, the future is in front of us, the past is behind us. This is just systems of associations in general language. But just for us to be aware how much meaning we superimpose on spatial structures, which is not irrelevant, actually very relevant. In fact, the next idea that I want to just brush upon is the idea of effort. And here the questions are the inner intention of the mover, the attitude of the mover that is being expressed, particularly toward pressure, space, time, dynamic. And I'll tell you in a moment roughly what they mean. So these are also called motion factor, effort elements, but they represent either a choice of the mover or unconscious expression, because we may not be conscious of which kind of efforts we're engaging with. Or we could do it intentionally, as in stage. On stage, in theory, the actor or the dancer is their own craft has to do with intentionally expressing certain qualities in service of a narrative, in service of a dramatic intention. So just to brush upon this, and you may realize as I talk about this, how much overlapping there is with the way we look at movement through other disciplines, and just taking into account that this type of structure was created from first-person experience by a group of dancers. So they talk about the relationship with pressure and resistance. So it's the difference of imagining that you're moving in an environment that offers no resistance. Think about very, very thin air that you are moving into versus moving into thick mud. So if you're moving in an environment that offers a lot of resistance, you will have to exert a lot of pressure. So that's what's called weight effort. And weight effort has a range, it's a qualitative range, it's a continuum that goes from the lack of resistance and pressure to the maximum resistance and pressure, also referred to as light and strong. Secondly, there's an idea of timing, and timing not as absolute time, but as the intention of the mover to fit a specific time frame. And this is the question about how much time do I have for a specific action? So do I have all the time I want to brush my teeth, or am I losing the bus? So this is basically what it means. And this will change our attitude toward the time frame, and how do I fit a specific action or movement in the time frame will create a different quality that ranges from the idea of sustained, which means stretched in time, or quick, which means condensed in time. Another idea is the idea of focus or attention. So, and this is like for anybody who has any engaged in any mindfulness practice, this should be very familiar, because it's the idea of focusing versus widening the scope of our awareness. It's also represented in our visual capacity of focusing, what we call foveal vision, focusing in the center of what we see, in the center of the visual field, the retina, versus the periphery of the visual field. So in this sense, that when we move, there could be a specific focus, a spatial focus, or we could have a broad awareness of the room. If you were to move around right now, and I was asking you, move with other people, but be aware of everyone, then you could not really focus on one person, because you would have to be aware of everyone. And that would be the idea of broadening your attention. So in the sort of the quality of spatial focus or attention ranges from indirect, also called flexible, this open, this wide use of attention or space, to direct, which is narrowing and focusing on one person. The difference between following one person or broadening our attention to everybody. And the last idea is the idea of flow, which means how do you engage with the movement dynamic? Do you control the movement dynamic, or you allow forces such as gravity, momentum, centrifugal force to continue the movement dynamic once you initiate it? So oftentimes when we're moving, we are intentionally crafting movement, but also you have the experience, all of us do, to just, for example, if my hand is here and I just let it fall, this movement of my hand or arm falling is not necessarily designed by me, but I'm allowing gravity to do it for me. So that concept is called free flow. Free flow means the idea that the movement dynamic is carried on by physical forces that act on my body, like Newton's law on Newton's apple. We are the apple sometimes because we are subject to centrifugal force, gravity. We are subject to momentum. We just have to allow that. We can also oppose to those movement dynamics, or which would be to bind the flow, to contain, to oppose. Okay. Now, you could, as I hope that you are hearing these words in also through a lens of motor control, which is completely appropriate. And yet the deepest meaning of this is expression, the relationship between function and expression, because these choices toward resistance, toward time frame, toward focus, toward movement dynamic are there to translate internal states, feelings, emotions. And so I want to bring up as a potential correlation or association in neuroscience the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made, which is the theory of constructed emotions. She's a neuroscientist working at NIH, the National Institute of Health in the United States. And I saw Valentina earlier talking about interoception. Well, this theory is the translation of interoception into affect, into emotions, which eventually are categories that have a verbal representation. Okay. So why do I bring this up? Because for many of us, these choices, the choice of pressure, the choice of time frame, the choice of focus, the choice of dynamic, when experienced in combination, which is always often the case, that maybe a movement could be strong and quick, they actually evoke certain physical states. Really, Laban called them states and drives, which are felt as movement gestalts that really are very emotionally rich for the person in their own system of associations. Okay, so they really translate function into expression, or sometimes called an inner outer. So what's inside to what's outside, what's visible and to the viewer with the internal landscape of the mover. And this brings to the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is the last category. And we're getting to this more communicative, expressive aspect of the movement experience and the movement description. So effort is one lens, and the last lens is called shape. The question of shape is how the body form, or the three-dimensional body silhouette, this volume that we inhabit, this volume that we embody, that we are, how does it change itself in response to the environment? And really in response to relationship. So here, the description of what we see, what we do, has to do with the changes in shape, modes of shape change, which they demonstrate shape variations, support the relationship with ourselves, other people, and the environment. They demonstrate relationship. And to give you just a touch of it, what does that even mean? Well, it means that sometimes a shape flow is a mode of shape change that has to do with my relationship to self, understanding that at any point I am, even if I close my eyes in a dark room and it's just me by myself, my volume is always growing and scaling down. Why? Because I'm breathing. It's really fundamental. So at any point, I'm always pulsing between growing and shrinking, breathing in, breathing out. My whole body, the shape of my body is always going through this cycle. That has to do purely with the relationship to myself. But I can also, this volume that I am, if I have a friend here, I can also reach out, which is shooting a branch of this volume toward a friend, toward anyone, toward an object, a person. That's called directional shape. It means that the shape of the body changes because of directionality, because of the intention to reach or bridge with somebody else, which is a different relational attitude. Different again from the moment I actually touch this person, I shake their hand, I make a connection with a surface or a contour that's not me, that's not mine. So typically, if this is somebody else's hand that I want to shake, and this is me, the first thing I do is reaching. So that's directional. The second thing is shaping their hands or carving their hands around my hand around theirs. So this is called shaping or carving. And the difference is that the shape or the volume of my body, instead of just reaching out, is adapting its own contour to the contour of another surface, which is a person, an object, whatever. So this element brings to relationship and interaction, whether it's relationship to self, directionality towards somebody else or something else, or adaptation.
Cecilia, apologies. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and this is the last.
We're running out of time.
And this is the end.
Yes. Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
that's the end. So that's the whole system, and that's sort of the rough introduction to say, and I have to hear like comments or questions. That this is like altogether, these questions that I presented are lenses through which you can ask questions about movement, and they're all really intertwined. Thank you, Valentina, for the reminder.
Perhaps there might be, we can just make literally one question, because I think we're out of time, right?
I think everybody is in a stunned silence, but there are some questions. Julia, you go first. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Really wonderful talk, Cecilia. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted, it's more of a comment and just say how important I find this, that you mentioned the theory of the theory of constructive motion by Lisa Meyer-Feldman, a wonderful framework within which to study things. This whole concept of, we develop a concept of something when we have a word for it. And then there's a book called They Have a Word for It, and I might not. So do I have the same concept? Do I not? So these kind of questions also relate to emotion research. And we actually found also that some of our results are much better explained by the theory of constructed emotion than by any of the basic frameworks of emotion. So I really connected with you there, and that was more of a comment, and thank you. So
You're very welcome.
Are there Peter and then Asaf? We'll do super sneaky quick questions. Go.
Me first.
Yeah. Only because that's why I saw it.
Yeah, okay, so then I will do the one with expressivity. So we just saw some figures before where you had a dancer doing the same movement but angrily or sadly, for example. I was wondering if you could describe that difference in Laban, or if there's more things that we can capture easily with the system, in the same way that you can't capture everything with music notation.
Well, yeah, so so you're asking the difference between the same movement performed as angry or sad? Well, yes. So in Laban offers language, right? So language for describing when you see a specific dancer, mover, actor in their own expression of sad and angry, because like I refuse to imagine that there is a universal sad or there is a universal angry. Like that would be dramatic. Or that you could say that this movement is angry, the other is sad. You know, the person is angry or sad as self-reported, hopefully. You can make guesses, and that's going back to the sort of neuroscience of empathy. You can make informed guesses that are based on your experience of such emotions. And it would be dramatic if we didn't consider that that was our own experience of that, and not the other. So besides the fact that the internal experience is not intelligible until shared in some, either verbally or in relationship, Then the Laban vocabulary allows you to describe how this specific human being is moving. For example, between angry and sad, in this particular instance, is there a difference in weight? So the kind of pressure that they exert in their own movement. Is there a difference in timing? Is there a difference in flow? Are they more using movement dynamics or controlling them? And would there be a difference in the way they use space? So in terms of focusing or allowing the focus to be broad. So Laban allows you to have the vocabulary to ask those questions and come up with observations and descriptions for that specific instance. The relationship to the internal experience has to be found with the person, with what they are communicating verbally or communicating in relationship for those who are nonverbal or maybe not articulate. Does that make sense?
Amazing answer. I am going to let Asaf, because I love you. But I'm also going to say that we'll use this as a springboard to our panel discussion. And Cecilia, if you have time, we are opening up a panel discussion on what methods we can use to capture some of the things that I'm only saying this because of how beautifully you just expressed this idea that this is a tool that has to be understood in terms of its limitations and strengths. So I think it fits perfectly with the panel discussion. So we'll have Asaf's question, but then I think we might come back to some of the things we're saying and use that as an opening. So go ahead, Asaf.
The question actually might already do that. I'm wondering, Cecilia, thank you. Would you make a distinction that I find relevant between motion and movement in English? We don't necessarily have it in every language. Particularly movement, as you know, is something that is more a felt experience under some people, or something that is even ontologically completely different, like in Erin Manning's work or something like that, versus motion, which is the thing we capture with motion capture machine. And I'm wondering, because in the way you were describing the Laban Bartenieff system, it seems ambiguous sometimes. So sometimes and I think that I'm curious how you see that system working, because we also just heard Sabine Koch earlier using a version, right? And she's using that, and she clearly states that the way she knows it's what I feel that what the annotator does, that they feel the baby does. There's nothing that no sensor would tell you different what is relevant there. So I'm just wondering for you if this distinction makes sense and how this specific framework addresses it.
So I understand you're saying that this distinction is a distinction about how we know. So motion as analyzed, I think you're saying kind of objectively or through parameters that are more objective versus movement as with the subjective component. Is that sort of roughly?
Let's simplify it this way, because we don't have a lot of time. So yes, but we can ask what objective means. But yes.
Yes, definitely.
All right, say yes. No, thank you.
No, it's extremely complicated. So I think the system, consider that the system was created. So this conceptual framework comes from, it's a phenomenological framework. It's a way to organize first-person experience, just for you to know. So, and I hope is taught this way, because sometimes it's taught really top-down as coming from authority, which is really not what the system is. The system is an attempt to organize first-person experience. That said, it's born as a relationship to self, because it's phenomenology, to our own experience. And it becomes, the moment it becomes a shared framework that other people relate to, and through language could be communicated across individuals, at that point it becomes language that is useful in relationship. That's why there is the subjective element, because movement observation conducted by a human being is subjective.
Yeah.
Thank you.